Today's daf is daf Chavches, and we'll start from the Mishnah on the top of the daf. This Mishnah is going to address the issue of using weights on Yontiv. It's a Masechet, and it's not appropriate for Yontiv. It's more appropriate for selling and buying, which is certainly not something that we do on Yontiv. Now, the Mishnah opens up by quoting a shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shokel Adam Basar Keneged Akli. That even though the Chachamim said that you're not allowed to weigh on Yontif with scales, use scales, but nevertheless, if you happen to know the weight of a certain utensil, and you can weigh the basar, the meat, Keneged Akli, and you want to determine the weight of the basar, and you'll pay for it after Yontif. So the Rashba writes that the isur of being shokel on Yontif is dafka b'shokel k'nei limpar la'acheret, only in a case where the seller wants to determine the weight so that he can sell it, and he knows the price at that weight. But a person in his private home, b'shokel b'toch beiso k'nei l'das kama lavashel, he wants to know how much of a certain ingredient, what weight to put into the pot for cooking, that he's allowed. However, it seems that the Rashba himself, in a different work, rescinded his original position, and he, in his final position, is more strict about it, even if a person is being shokel b'toch beiso liatzmo. And the issue really at stake here is, who's the Mishnah addressing? Is the Mishnah talking to a tabach, a butcher who's selling meat, or is it addressing itself to a private person who wants to eat meat? And if we assume that this Mishnah is a continuation of the previous Mishnah, which talks about the Bnei Achabura, then it would seem that we're not talking about a tabach per se, and rather rotzim licholek b'neihem basar, amongst the Bnei Achabura, they want to divide up the meat. And would it be permissible to weigh on behalf of each person the basar? And the Mishnah is allowing it, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda at least, keneged akli, or keneged akofitz. And a kofitz is a butcher's knife, and presumably he can determine the weight of the butcher's knife, and now he has a piece of meat that weighs the same exact identical weight as the kli itself. Chachamim omrim ein mashgichim b'kach maznaim kol ikar, which means that when you have scales and you want to weigh on the scales, then even if he does an act of weighing which is unusual, like he places basar on one side of the scales and a utensil on the other side, or the butcher's knife, which would be called a shkila b'shinui. It's an unusual type of way of measuring something. Even so, it would seem that it's also according to the Chachamim, and they disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. Now, what is the meaning of the word kol ikar? What is the emphasis here, the addition of those two words in the Chachamim? The Gemara says, kol ikar, my kol ikar, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Why didn't you say Chacham Mosrim? Afilu l'shama min akbarim. Even if he doesn't put the meat on the scales in order to weigh them, but simply he wants to put them high up so that the mice won't get to the meat, nevertheless, it's also because it looks like he's weighing the meat. Amar Avidi bar Ovin, hu desalya bisrita. When the Chachamim prohibited putting meat on the scales, even if he's only doing so to protect the meat from the mice, that's only in a case of what we call talia bitrita maznayim atluyim bitabas sheba tolim osa kisheshoklim kidei sheshtei hatkapos yio yisharos. He's saying that we're talking about a very specific case in which it looks like he's using a scale to weigh his meat. These are scales that are held up by a certain ring, and they have a tlia, meaning a hanging chain, let's say, coming out of this ring, of this tabas, and there are two kapos, and they are absolutely straight. They are kapos yisharos. And this is nira kenosein as habasa shamla mishkal. But if, let's say, he has scales that are not attached and hanging from this tabas, then he's allowed to put, even according to the Chachamim, on one side of the scales meat, even if it's on the scales, but nevertheless, these are scales that don't look in a very profound, obvious way like the scales that are used to weigh, because it's not, these two kapos that are coming out of one tabas. And therefore, if he wants to protect his basar from the mice, then the Chachamim would allow that to happen. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Mishmul Tabach Uman, a professional butcher, also lishkol basar bayad. He's not allowed to even take the mishkalos in one hand and the meat in the other hand. In other words, he has some, a weight, and he holds it in one hand, puts the meat in the other hand, and he somehow evaluates that they're the same weight. That is prohibited in the case of a tabach uman. And the reason for that is because this is the way an uman would sometimes weigh things even during the week in order to determine how much he's going to charge for that piece of meat. What he used to do was the butcher would sometimes fill up a utensil with water, and this is called memale mayim bekli, and yesh bedofno charitzim l'simon, what we call a measuring cup. So he's got incisions, lines on the outer walls of this utensil, and when he puts meat inside this cup of water, then based on the volume of water that overflows and kamus shalamayim sha'olim, the water rises, because when you put a solid substance into a cup of water, obviously the water level will rise. It's displaced. And olim umagiyim li'echem min hacharitzim. And he can tell, the weight. He can determine the weight of this piece of meat by which line the water reaches. The water level will reach a certain line, and he can figure out what that weight is. That he's not allowed to do on Yom Tov, because that's the way he weighs it during Chol, during the weekdays. And it looks like a Ma'aseh Chol when the tabach is measuring something for the purpose of selling. Another din. Amar Rab Chiya bar Ashi, Asur, again l'tabach, lasos beis yad b'basa. What they used to do is sometimes, in order to grab onto the meat and transfer it from one person to the other, he used to drill a hole in the meat itself so that he can hold with his hands inside, by putting his hands inside the hole, and so he's able to carry the meat from one place to the other. And on Yom Tov, he's going to have to do a shinoi, because this is their chol. Otherwise, it looks like mekach umemkar, like he's selling. Amar Ravina, however, Ravina says, ubiyada shari, that which Rab Chiya bar Ashi prohibited, making this beis yad, making this handle in the meat itself, that's only if he uses a knife to carve out that handle, that hole from which he's going to carry it. That's derech hole. But if he makes a shinui, and instead of using a knife to make the hole, he actually punches, so to speak, in the meat with his hands, and he makes a nekev by using his finger without employing a knife. Sorry, that's mutter, because then he's doing it b'derech shinui. It's not like the way he does it in chol, and that's mutter. Amar Rav Huna, mutter laso simon bebasar. A person is allowed to, on Yontif, he's allowed to make a sign on the basar. And that sign will indicate that it's his. It's sort of like identifying an identification mark that's unique to him. And he's going to be able to determine without any doubt, with all certainty, that this is his meat. So he makes a sima in the basar. And here the Shulchan Aruch says, by the way, that you can even allowed to do this with a knife. Before we left out the knife. But here he's just making a sima. And the Gemara gives now an example of a simon. I call it the Hamantashin simon. Ki ha de Rabba bar Rav Huna, when he would send meat from his house, he used to cut out pieces of meat that looked like a triangle on three points, that had 3 points to it. Every piece of meat had 3 points. Rashi has a little bit of a diagram. Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Shimon Rebbe, two sons of Rebbe, and they wanted to divide up meat equally between the two of them. What would they do? Shoklim mana keneged mana b'yontif. They would take one piece of meat and another piece of meat and weigh the two. And if they were equal in weight, maybe they'd have to subtract a little bit from one of the piece of meat. But once they equalized in meat, that's when they divided up and told the two brothers. Himan. And this minhag of Reb Chia and Reb Shimon reflects the shita, the heter of Loker Rab Yehuda, Loker Rabbanon. We're going to have to introduce a third sheet there because according to Rab Yehuda, Amar Shokol on the Basa Keneged HaKliya Keneged HaKofitz. Rabbi Yehuda was only willing to be lenient if you're using a certain utensil, the weight of which you can deter, or a knife. Keneged HaKli in, Keneged Bidi Achrini lo. Apparently, he only allowed shkila in a way that would not be at all similar to chol when he does it Keneged HaKli. But if it's mana Keneged mana, then that's the way people actually divide up. Let's say we buy in partnership. I'm going to buy half the meat for you, half the meat. So that's what we do. We do a mana keneged mana. And since that is a very commonplace kind of method of weighing something, mana keneged mana is prohibited on Yontif because it's a ma'aseh chol. It's shkila kederech chol. Now, Rabbanan ha'amri ein mashkichin b'kaf mazayim kol ika. The Rabbanan say, I don't care what you're putting on the other side of the scale to weigh and measure the weight of your meat. It's always awesome. And therefore, certainly, mana keneged mana is awesome. Then, whose shita is reflected in this situation? The two brothers, the sons of Rebbe, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon, when they divided up on Yontif, mana keneged mana. Inuti avike, Rabbi Yeshua. There's a third sheet in Tadnai. Tesanya, we learned in a Beitza, Rabbi Yeshua Omer shoklim mana keneged mana b'Yontif. That's not considered a ma'aseh chol. It's not mufhak. It's not an obvious way of weighing something. Again, amongst private people that are dividing up something amongst themselves, but otherwise, this heichet nimta partners, they go in to buy and then they split it and they weigh it. In the context of dini momentus of sale and partnerships, that's very rare. So therefore, this kind of mana keneged mana is a shinui and it's mutter on Yontif. And on Rav Yosef halacha Rav Yeshua. And Rav Yosef says that we paskin like Rav Yeshua. We were matir shkila of mana kedeged mana on Yontif, and we're not worried that it looks like a ma'aseh. It's not a ma'aseh. And what led Rav Yosef to the conclusion that we could be so lenient in this kind of method of shkila on Yontif based on the price that quotes Rav Yeshua as the third shita? And the answer is holusnan b'bchoros kavos. We find a Mishnah in Bechoros on Daf Lamed Aleph that supports Rav Yeshua. Tisnan Psule Mukdosh. This is a carbon that had a mum, and it's now disqualified from the Mizbeach, and you're allowed to be poded. You can redeem it. And the halacha is Hana Osan Lehegdesh. The Hana from this redemption, this pigeon, is to benefit Hegdesh. They will gain from this because they'll get a high price for this pigeon, and therefore we say that we normally would not allow a minhag chol with regard to kudshim to weigh it in a way that we do mundane meat on a regular day, because that would be a bizayin kudshim. But here, we're going to allow just simply putting it on a scale and weighing it so that we can determine how much to be poded for Hegdesh. And the reason for that is because Hegdesh is benefiting by it. They're going to get the money of the pigeon. So shkila b'maznayim or be'itlis, which would normally be derech chol and be unappropriate for Hegdesh, we're going to look aside because it's hana osan lehegdesh. Hegdesh will benefit. There are two, however, exceptions. And that's bechor and maseh. There, if you're weighing in order to determine the market value, so that's not going to benefit Hegdesh, that's going to benefit the island. Why? Because pigeon, in the case of Bechar Maisa, like any kudshim, is only feasible after Nafal B'mum. And once it's Nafal B'mum, then the more expensive and valuable the meat is, the better it is for the bailant, because now after the pigeon, they get that meat, and they get a more valuable piece of meat. So since in the cases of Bechar and Masechet, it's the Cholim, L'Baileim, and Bechar L'Kohen, Ma'aseh Yisrael, is if a Hegdesh is not going to gain anything by selling it on a high price, and therefore we're going to be Machmir, and we're going to avoid any minhag chol in the sale, or for that matter, the pigeon of a balmum that was shechted, and we're not going to allow you to sell it in the open market or weigh it in maznayim. That's a bizayin lehegdesh. Ulami writes here in a note, Mutar limkar b'beisa yidei sheikach basa chulin sheodea mishkalo. He has another piece of meat, and he knows exactly its weight. V'shoklim mana keneged mana b'bechar. And he can take the meat of the bechar after the shchita, and he can be shokel it, he can weigh it, keneged the basa chulin. And we see clearly from this Mishnah that lishkol mana keneged mana, that's not considered a ma'aseh chol. If you want to do a regular classic weight, weighing process over scales, that's prohibited in ma'aser and bechar. But we're going to allow you to be shokel mana keneged mana. You have a piece of basa chulin, and you have the basa of bechar maser, and it's almum, and you just figure out how they equal in weight. And this would support the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua, who is matir lishkol mana keneged mana on Yontif. Notice if it's not a Ma'aseh Chol as far as Kodshim is concerned, then it's not a Ma'aseh Chol as far as Yontif is concerned. That's the underlying analogy of Rav Yosef. Amalei Abai turns to Rav Yosef says, "V'dim. Logically, I don't think you have a proof from the Mishnah Bechoros, because I don't think the Mishnah Bechoros is expressing the same view as Rabbi Yoshua. Ad kan lo kam Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua is only mata lishkol mana keneged mana hacha in the case of Yont. And why did he accept that leniency? Elam ipnei, because the leka b'tayin kudshim. The Isser is only because of Ma'aseh Chol, but there's no kudshim over here. We're not talking about kudshim, we're talking about chulin. So therefore, Rabbi Yeshua was not concerned about a Ma'aseh Chol in the case of Mana Keneged Mana. Aval Hasam, but there in the case of Bechar, the Ika B'Zayin Kudshim, there's a whole other element that enters into the equation. We cannot be noig in a Bechar, a Ma'aseh Chulin, because that would be B'Zayin Kudshim. Is then even Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi would agree that lo yishkol mana keneged mana, we cannot accept mana keneged mana. That's going to be prohibited. So don't tell me that this Mishnah in Bechoros reflects the Shita Rabbi Yeshua. Could be that Rabbi Yeshua would disagree with the Mishnah in Bechoros. He was only lenient in the case of Chulin, but in the case of Bechor and Maser, which has the status of Kodshim, there he would not allow mana keneged mana. Inami, the Gemara is going to reject this raya of Rav Yosef from the Mishnah Bechores, as far as its comparison to Yontiv, to be matir shokel mana keneged mana. Ad kan lo kami rabbanan hasam. There in the Mishnah Bechores that they were matir limkar b'yofin zeh elamishum. De lo mechse keuvdin de chol, that a mechira of mana keneged mana does not look like a ma'aseh chol, because that's not the normal way that sellers will weigh meat, and therefore it's going to be mutter on yontif. Aval hacha, but if you're talking about shutfis, and two partners are dividing up basam, like the story of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon Berebi, the mechse kuvdu the chol, to do that on Yontiv, it looks like a ma'aseh chol, because shutfim, when they split the shutfis, they do it mana keneged mana. So it could very well be that the Rabbanan, no, they would not be mata lishkol mana keneged mana, not reflecting the shita of Rabbi Yeshua, who is mata lishkol mana keneged mana, even in the case of chaluk. The Gemara asks a side question here. The entire premise that underlies this story about two brothers, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon, that they measured in order to guarantee that both would have the exact equal portion of meat. Are you meant to assume that Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon, the children of Rebbe, were makpid one on the other? They were very, very demanding that it should be precise. For her, I'm going to give you a story that reflects the chiba, the great love between these two brothers. They would be mavater one for the other, and they weren't makvid when one took this and the other took that. Ani sheiv benisa. These are the 7 fish, the asu lebei Rebbe, that came to the house of Rebbe. Vishtaka chamesh minayu, and 5 of them were located Bei Rabbi Chia, in the house of Chia. He took them home. And lo kapid Reb Shimon Rebbe. Reb Shimon was not makbid on it. Aren't you taking from Beis Abba more than your allotted proportion? If they were makbid one on the other, why were they makbid here? That on Yontif, when they split it up, they had to use the method of mana keneged mana. Why? Papa, actually, we're missing a very important piece of the puzzle of this story. Put another person, says Rav Papa, in the middle, which means that the Ma'aseh was not exactly the way we understood it between Rav Shimon and Rav Chia, but rather one of the two of them divided up the basar with another person. And he was generally accustomed to divide up the basar with that other person. And we don't know exactly which of these two, Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosef, because they would do a chalukah. Rabbi Shimon, Rebbe is Ubar Kapar. The cholek, the third person, that unidentified anonymous person, was none other than Bar Kapar. So this whole story, which gave you the impression that Rav Chia and Rav Shimon were makbid one on the other, that's not. They weren't makbid on another at all. It was just one of those two with another person. Now I think I made a mistake here. Let me just correct myself in assuming that Rav Chia and Rav Shimon were brothers. No, I don't think so. But they were very close colleagues. The Mishnah now is going to address Melechas Ochel Nefesh, that's mutar and yontif. And the question is, what about something that isn't in itself eaten, but it prepares food? It's machshirei ochel nefesh. For example, sharpening a knife in order to cut food with it, or to shecht with it. And the Mishnah says, ein mashchizin es asakim b'yontif. If we're talking about a classic sharpening of a knife, which is done with a certain utensil that is dedicated to sharpening knives, that's prohibited. Aval, but if he does it in an unusual way, a shinui, for example, masi'ah al gabei chaverta. Did you ever see it where they take two knives and they sharpen one against the other? That's mutar. The Gemara says, when it says this din that you're not allowed to use mashchezes, a certain utensil to sharpen your knife on yontif, ella b'mashchezes shel even, or mashchezes shel eitz mutar. In other words, if the mashchezes is made out of stone, then it really does a great job in sharpening a knife. And therefore it looks like he's doing it the way he would do it before. But if it's made of wood, then it really doesn't do a great job in sharpening the knife. And therefore it's allowed, it's a shinui. His mutar lahashchiz es asakin b'yontiv mashchezes shel eitz. Om Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shmuel, but the amrit shel even asur, even that which you said that in mashchezes shel even it's asur, because of the very precise job that it does in sharpening a knife, even that has to be limited. It's not always the case that I cannot use this mashchezes shel even, lo amarin el lechadido. If my goal, if my purpose is to sharpen the knife, that's prohibited in a mashchezes shel even. Aval, but on the other hand, la'avir shamnunisa, if his purpose is not to sharpen the knife, but to remove the oily substance that accumulated on the outer surface of the knife, to be morid shuman, hadovuk aleh, and in that case, he's not at all interested in sharpening his knife, mutar, that's not called tikkun kli. That's like washing a kli. So this sakin, he's not doing it through the mashchezes lechadida, but rather he wants to clean the knife. The knife is full of guk, an accumulation of some oily, fatty substance. So instead of cleaning it in hot water, he used the mashchezes shel even, and that he's allowed to do, because that's not called tikkun kli. When you wash a kli and remove its filth, that does not qualify as tikkun kli. So the Gemara's medayik Michlal from Shmuel used to derive the following conclusion: Ibe shel eitz mashchezes of eitz, which Rav Huna said is mutar, is afilu lechadada nami mut. In other words, Rav Huna said that you are prohibited from Evan and you're only allowed Bishal Eitz. From Shmuel, we get the impression that on that which Rav Huna had said it's also Bishal Evan, but Mut Bishal Eitz, that in Bishal Evan, ha'isur dafka lechadada, implying that Bishal Eitz, it's mutter, even lechadada. So we're going to derive from Shmuel the conclusion that in a mashchezes shal eitz, you're allowed to use it even lechadada. And that's what Rav Huna meant when he said, "Avol mashchezes shal eitz mutter." Mutter means even for the purpose of sharpening the knife. So this is one version of the statement of Shmuel, differentiating between lechadada and shamnu nisa, lahaver shamnu nisa. And now the Gemara has a second lishna, the lishna of Basra. Ika demasi le aseifa. Some had the words of Shmuel as a commentary on the last part of Rav Huna. When he said b'shal eitz mutter, we said according to the first lishna that b'shal eitz is mutter even lechadada. On that, Omer Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel to qualify the head of b'shal eitz. The Omer b'shal eitz mutter lo amarna lahavir shamnu nisa aval lechadada also. In other words, if Shmuel's statement was a qualification of the Reisha, which was the Chumrah of Rav Huna, in the case of Mashchezes Shal Eitz, Shal Evan, that you are enjoined from using that Mashchez Shal Evan to be Mashchez Sakim B'Yontif, then Shmuel is coming L'Kula and saying that the Isser mentioned by Rav Huna in the Reish of his words, in the case of Mashchez Shal Evan, that only applies L'Chadada. But I can use a Mashchez Shal Evan Lahavir Shamnusa. And in the case of eitz, by process of elimination, you're allowed to use a mashchezes shel eitz, even lechadada. But now, in the second Mishnah, Shmuel's statement is coming to qualify the seifa of Rav Huna. And that is the mashchezes shel eitz mutter. On that, Shmuel made the comment that I'm going to limit that heter to a case when mashchezes shel eitz, he's interested lahavir shamnunisa, avol lechadada also. Mechlal the mashchez shel even afilu lahavir shamnunisa also. So as in the first lishna, a mashchez shel eitz according to a mashchez shel even according to Shmuel would be mutter if it's lechadada. I'm sorry, if it's lahavir shamnunisa. A mashchezes shel eitz would be mutter even lechadada. That's the first lishna of Shmuel. Now in the second lishna of Shmuel, is saying just the opposite. That b'shel eitz is only mutter lahavir shamnu nisa. But lechadada certainly is also even in the case of mashchezes shel eitz. In the case of mashchezes shel even, where in the first lishna it was Lahavir Shamnusa was mutter. Now in the second lishna, Lahavir Shamnusa is us. Ika de Masni Lo, it's apparently a third possibility. And Shmuel is not commenting at all on Rav Huna. It's a separate comment, independent. Amasnisa, on our mission. Our mission says, "Ein mashchizin esakim b'yontiv mashchezes." Omer Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel lo shanu elo lechadada. Avol lahavir shamnu nisa mut. You're allowed to sharpen on yontiv your mashchezes for the sake of lahavir shamnu nisa. Michlal, And we should derive from this interpretation that the al gabi chaverta, that which the Mishnah was mat in the sefer, right, to sharpen one against the other, afilu lechad donami mut. Even if his kavana is to sharpen it, it's also mutter. In other words, that which the Mishnah prohibited in the Reisha, the Mishnah was lenient in the sefer, so that the Mishnah never enjoined us in the Reisha from Hashchaza unless it's for the purpose of L'chadada. And therefore, when he was matir in the Sefer L'asiyah al Gabi Chaverta, that would apply even L'chadada. And now we have another Lishna. Ika de Masni Law, some have the words of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, as Sefer, Aval Masiyah al Gabi Chaverta, Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel Oshanu Ella, Lahavish and Nunisa. Even the great heter of sharpening the knives one against the other, that only applies if he's trying to clean off the knife. Aval lechadada, if he wants to sharpen the knife, also. And the Gemara says, Michalal, we see from this in Mashchezes, Afil lahavishim Nunisa, so we never found any sheet until now. We didn't come across or encounter anyone who was machmer in the case of lahavish Nunisa, but now in this very last Lishna, which is called Icha Damasni, we don't know who it is, now we have a Chumrah even in the case of Lahavir Stam Nunisa. Montana, the Mashchezes also. To whom can we attribute our Mishnah, which is anonymous, that prohibits Mashchezes to sharpen the knife on Yontif? I know that it's not Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda was matir on Yontif, even malacha l'tzorech machshirei ochel nefesh. And certainly sharpening a knife for the purpose of cutting meat is nothing short of machshirei ochel nefesh. The Sanya we learned in the Beitza, ein ben Yontif l'Shabbos el ochel nefesh milvad, Rabbi Yehuda matir af machshirei ochel nefesh. So according to the Tanakhama, this price, so we can only be matir and yontif l'tzorech ochel nefesh mamish. And Rabbi Yehuda expanded the heter to include machshirei ochel nefesh, like sharpening a knife. Amalei Rava, l'Rav Chizda. Darshinan mishma. Are we allowed to say in your name, halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda? Meaning that you paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Chizda paskin like him, and you are matir malacha l'tzorech machshirei ochel nefesh on yontif. And the reason apparently that moved Rava to make that statement is because Rav Chizda pointed out that, okay, you learned our Mishnah, but you should know about the Beitza and the Shita Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe you paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. Amalei, Rav Chizda responded, Rava, let it be the will. Techolki hani mili mal yosa tidrashun mishmei. Anything good that I say, like this drasha, you could tell it over my name, and therefore you can mention in my name that halacha is Rabbi Yehuda. Now the Gemara brings a couple of stories. Now, Rav Nachman bereid Rabbi Yosef. Avika imna kami de Rava. I was in the company of Rava on Yontif. Havika ma'aber, and here we're going to turn to Chav Chesed Amud Beis. L'sakina fuma didikula.